So now we're going to talk about materials, and materials are like when you add color or texture or things like that to your objects. And we're just going to be going over the basics of this. This could get incredibly complicated, and so we'll try to stick to some basics just so you understand it. So I've got my Suzanne head selected here. I'm gonna click on the materials properties, which is the material properties, which is the little red one second from the bottom on the right hand side of the screen. And there is no material, or I should say that there's always a default material on an object in Blender, which is this kind of white generic color. So the plane has it and the Suzanne head has it. So as soon as you hit new, by default it creates what's called a principled BSDF, which is kind of a super material, or what's called shader, that is attached to the object, and nothing really changes because it's still white and we haven't really given it much. This can be really daunting and intimidating, but we're only going to focus on a few of the things here. So first thing is, if I click on the base color, now this is just exactly what it sounds. This is the color of the object. Let me go into material preview mode, maybe make this a little simpler to look at it first. So can change the material, and it's kind of a, by default, I'd say a kind of a plasticky looking material. So I can give it this purple color, and if I go back and I go ahead and render it, it will hopefully render in that color. Good. So pretty straightforward. Base color just gives the object an overall color. All right. So moving on from there, there are just a few other important ones to play with here that kind of can give it interesting qualities. So let's skip down for now to roughness. Roughness is basically how shiny or how matte. So if you think of a car paint job, you think of something that's really shiny and reflective. It's also metallic, which we'll talk about in a second. But if you think about a kind of a glossy surface, so a glazed ceramic, if you give it a roughness of 0, that's going to be a really shiny material. So I'm going to render that shiny material, and with something detailed enough, you should be able to really start to see it. I might try to change the lighting a little bit to give us a more interesting light. It's kind of sitting on the top of its head here, so let's do that. But you can already start to see it. So if we go to our light, who knows where our light is? I think it's this light. I'm going to grab it, move it over here. Grab it and move it. Oops. Grab it and move it along the y-axis this way. That's what I want. Some longer shadow. Much better. And I wonder if I can make it, let's make it sharper. Maybe not that sharp. All right, back to our object, and our roughness is set to 0, and if we render this, it's going to render it as a very shiny object. You really could see it like on the nose and up here on the brows. You really start to get a sense of the material. Okay, so So let's look at the opposite. Let's take the roughness all the way up to 1. So it's basically a value of 0 and 1. And we're going to render it. So now we've got a completely flat, no reflection at all. There's no light bouncing off. It's like absorbing all the light. Not too many materials are really like this. You can think of like maybe clay or something like that. So we'll leave it. All right, so let's take the roughness back to, let's say 0.5 in between. And now let's look at the metallic. So from my understanding that either a material has a metallic value or it doesn't. So it's either a 1, which says, yes, I'm metallic, or 0, no, I'm not metallic. But that said, you can certainly drag it somewhere in between, and it does change the quality of the look of it. So you can do whatever you want here. There's no rules that you have to follow. You can really see it here is that you can give it somewhat of a metallic look, but generally the idea is that, okay, this is a metallic material, so I'm going to put the value to 1. And now if we go back and we play with roughness, we get some pretty cool looking things. So this is a really, really shiny metallic material. We could render it. And you start to see the quality of a really shiny metal, like chrome, basically. So if you gave this, so in Material Preview, you get this really cool environment, reflections in the environment, and you can, remember, change that up here. I could change it to reflect all these different kinds of things. But again, these are just previews. So, so in our rendered mode, we've got, so if I change this color back to white, let's say, let's change it to like a very light gray, and I render it, I'm essentially, this would be like chrome, right? Perfectly reflective, shiny metal. All right, so I'm gonna give it a color again for fun, because it's more fun. And so the other thing, you can skip a lot of these. Basically, the other thing, which can be kind of tricky to work with, is transmission. And transmission is apparently set to either 1 or 0, or in between, sorry, it can definitely be in between. And this has to do with how transparent your material is. So a transmission of 1 should technically be an object that is transparent, like glass. It doesn't look like it here, and I have had some luck making this work, and I've also had times when it doesn't work. It must have something to do with the light, or that it doesn't have anything behind it to shine through. I'm not really exactly positive. Let me see if we can see it here. Start to preview. Let's take the metallic down. Yeah, keep the roughness down. So looking from this point of view, yeah, I mean, so with the transmission set to 0 here, you just looking at the back of the head of this thing. When we bring the transmission up, you definitely are seeing, it's calculating that, so it's seeing through the object into its, sort of the itself, right? It's all the reflections of this material. And here you see the translucency here, or the transparency, and this white stuff being reflected, well, I would think is that torus in the distance. I'm not really sure. So let's see if we can, oh yeah, well here you can see, if we go back to this point of view, let's render it here. So now here, I mean, that's working. You can start to see that it's definitely transmission set to 1. We've got the metallic set all the way down to 0, which seemed to help. and definitely are noticing that it's like a glass material, kind of like a solid glass look to me anyway. Um, you can change the transmission roughness, which would give a kind of almost like a frosted look. Let's see how that looks. You're giving some roughness to the glass, so that also works. Yeah, so you're getting there. Kind of, this is more like a gem or something like that, like a jade thing. All right, so this material really does do a whole lot. If you click on it, you do see there are other materials. There is a glass material, but again, you can create the look of glass using a principled shader. There are several others that you could play with, but from what I understand, this principled shader is like the mega shader that does everything. You can simulate any kind of material with it. So that is the basis of just adding a color and a type of material to an object. The next thing you'd want to know how to do is create a kind of texture. And sometimes you'd want something to have the texture of you know, an image that you'd find, like the texture of concrete or something like that. So I'm going to show you a couple things. So if you click on base color and you click on this little circle to the right of it, it opens up the texture menu, and you can choose things like brick texture, and it will keep the other. You're still got a principled shader, so if it's still translucent or transparent, oops, and you're still going to have those effects. I'm going to take that transparency off, and so you can really see it. Now you could play around with how frequent the bricks are. You can change the color of each part of the brick here. So this is just a built-in type of texture, and you can change the mortar color. Right, so now I've created this weird custom brick color on the object. All right, so that's, and the scale also changes, like how often it repeats. You can play around with these things. It's really, really, you know, pretty intuitive. It's just a matter of, okay, well, what happens if I change the width of the brick, or the height, blah, blah, blah. It's not so complicated. All right, so that's, let's see if I can go to, oops, material preview, maybe, yeah. Yeah, so material preview should preview this. All right, so I'll change it here to something else. Let's go to checker texture. Same thing. You're going to have the colors you previously chose. And now I've got a checkered texture going on. Same deal. You can change the scale. So bigger checkers, smaller checkers. And it still has the quality of a pretty shiny material. You can bring the roughness up and create a rougher, more matte material. There are a few other things. There's this thing called magic texture, and these are all just built into Maya or into Blender. Oops. Okay, so the other one that's really kind of opens up many other doors is image texture. And if I click on image texture, well, the default will be that it just looks like nothing, like a black matte texture got added to the object. But an image texture allows you to attach a JPEG or an image to wrap around the object, a texture that you can use from any picture that you can get your hands on. So when you hit image texture, new windows pop open where you say new or open. And you can there's some other options. So I'm going to go to the internet, and I'm going to type in concrete texture. And I'm going to go to images and see if I can hit high resolution and just download. Wow, that's a nice big one. Let's see, is that going to let me actually do that? Probably not. Fine, let's just choose this because it's, so I'm going to right click and I'm going to say save image as, and I'm going to call it concrete texture, and I'm going to put it on my desktop so I know where to find it. Save. All right, easy enough. I'm going to go back into Blender and go back to my Suzanne head, and so now I've got image texture selected, and I'm going to choose open. So I'm going to say I want to open an image that I know I have. So I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to choose concrete texture. And if you did it correctly, it should show up as a texture on the object. Let's look at our rendered view. And let's go ahead and render it without doing anything else. This gets pretty neat because once you introduce photorealism in terms of textures and things like that, combined with good lighting or realistic lighting, you can start to very quickly simulate just photorealistic images. It changes things quickly, but you also will notice right here some problems, and this is something we're going to get into later, which has to do with what's called texture mapping. If you think about how you can take a cardboard box and wrap paper around it, it has to wrap around in a certain way, and the way that this default Suzanne head is made, some areas of the texture look undistorted and correct as it wraps around the head, but some areas, like where the eyes are really bad, and this is a whole different lesson of texture mapping, and we'll get into that later. It's can be fairly complex, but if we just kind of look around, let's go into material preview mode, just look around, you can see that parts of it are parts of the image are undistorted and parts are. You also see the seam. So the image is literally wrapping around the head, and it has a seam toward the back of the head. And you can see it right there. And that is what causes that to look that way. So, this is important to know, is that all the other attributes, properties in here are still valid. You can take this concrete texture that we just added to this, and you can make it metallic. I don't know exactly what that would look like or what that would be like, but we could make a metallic looking concrete, like it's polished or something. It's sort of a strange look, but it's pretty cool. You can get this effect that wasn't so flat, and I could take that metallic back down, and I can make it really shiny with taking the roughness down, which is more like a kind of marble. When you see the reflection on it. And of course you can take the roughness all the way up and create a much more flat looking thing. You can also do something very strange, which would be, I don't know how this would work, is that of course if you bring the transmission all the way up, I don't know how that works. You're now sort of, it's revealing that black kind of flat material that was underneath the material, so it doesn't really work to add transmission to a image texture. So I believe that is everything I wanted to talk about with the basics of materials. This could get could turn into a very long menu or long video. Yeah, I'm going to stop right there.